Rabbi, you're on tomorrow too, right?
Yes.
Good, because I'm going to clear my schedule so I can cut both Thursday and Friday.
Okay, amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
The fun begins. One of my favorite stories is right here. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. We'll read the parsha in a nutshell. We'll read the short version as we do, and then we'll see how much time we have for analysis. So here we go. The name of the parsha is Miketz, means at the end, and is found in Genesis 41:1. Okay. Joseph's imprisonment finally ends when Pharaoh dreams of 7 fat cows that are swallowed up by 7 lean cows, and of 7 fat ears of grain swallowed by 7 lean ears. So Joseph interprets the dreams to mean that 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of hunger, and advises Pharaoh to store grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh appoints Joseph governor of Egypt. Joseph marries Asnat, daughter of Potiphar, and they have 2 sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Okay, so this is sort of the understatement of the year, that you lose all the drama. Basically, the story is that Pharaoh has these dreams. He's troubled by these dreams. Nobody could interpret the dreams. Now, Egypt has a very sophisticated system of dream interpretation, but nobody can figure out this dream. And then when nobody can figure out the dream, the baker we read about last week, who was in prison with Joseph, says, oh, when I was in prison, there was a Hebrew kid who interprets dreams. Maybe he'll have the interpretation. So they bring Joseph before Pharaoh, and Joseph interprets these dreams, and Pharaoh is so impressed by the interpretation that he says, okay, you get the job, here are the keys, you get the job, and you're going to run the economy. That is the story, which, of course, is just a broad outline, raises many questions, which is, many answers, but the basic question is, how come nobody else, what's so great about Joseph's interpretation? How come nobody else can think of it? So we'll do a little bit about that, but we'll get to that in a minute. So let's continue the story. Now we go back to Joseph's brothers, because if there's a famine and everybody has to come to Egypt, including the brothers of Joseph, have to come down to Egypt to buy bread. So now Joseph has his opportunity to interact with his family again, only this time they have no idea he's Joseph. So let's continue. Famine spreads throughout the region, and food can be obtained only in Egypt. 10 of Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to purchase grain. The youngest, Benjamin, stays home, for Jacob fears for his safety. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. He accuses them of being spies, insists that they bring Benjamin to prove that they are who they say they are, and imprisons Simon as a hostage. Later they discover that, and then he sends them back. So they're going back. They came 10 brothers. Remember, there are 12 brothers. Joseph is gone. The youngest, Benjamin, is the youngest and the father's favorite again, because remember, the favorites in that family are always the sons of Rachel. So Joseph was the older son of Rachel. Once Joseph is gone, now I guess there's a new favorite, which is the younger son of Rachel. Rachel only had 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. So now Benjamin is with the father. So Joseph is selling the grain of Egypt. 10 brothers show up. He says, you're spies. They have no idea who he is. He says, go, I'm keeping one of you here. Go bring Benjamin. And then he also puts, on the way home, later they discover that the money they paid for their provisions has been mysteriously returned to them. So there's some setup in the process. We continue. Jacob agrees to send Benjamin only after Judah assumes personal and eternal responsibility for him. This time, Joseph receives them kindly, releases Simon, and invites them to an eventful dinner at his home. But then he plants his silver goblet, purportedly imbued with magic powers, in Benjamin's sack. When the brothers set out for home, the next morning they are pursued, searched, and arrested when the goblet is discovered. Joseph offers to set them free and retain only Benjamin as his slave. And that's the end of this week's parsha. If you want the conclusion of the drama, you have to come back next week. So obviously Joseph is trying to set them up. He's trying to achieve something here. What exactly he's trying to do, there's all kinds of interpretations. But I think the most basic and most straightforward interpretation is that Joseph wants to see whether or not they repented. How do you see if someone repented? So there are different stages of repentance. And as we discussed on Sunday at great length, because we're reading these stories in in depth on Sundays, you have to, if the same scenario presents itself again, and a person has the same motivation to sin, and a person has the same incentive to sin, and does not sin, that's true repentance. In this case, here the brothers have a chance again. It's exactly the repeat of this case of Joseph's story. You have one favored son. It used to be Joseph, now it's Benjamin. They could easily get rid of Benjamin by saying, oh, it's not our fault. The emperor of Egypt took him as a slave. And then they would get what they wanted. They get rid of the brother, the favored brother, the son of Rachel, who's sort of their competition for their father's favor. Instead, Judah, who was instrumental in the sale and probably caused the sale, Judah says, no, I'm taking responsibility. And he's going to end up saying, I don't want a spoiler alert, but the bottom line is, ultimately, that's what Joseph is trying to see. What are they going to do with Benjamin? And if they do make the right choice with Benjamin, then that means that they repented. If they repented, now it's time to reunite with the family. Now, a long time has passed since the initial sale of Joseph. At this point, it's more than 20 years. Okay, so that's the parsha in a nutshell. There's a lot to say, a lot to talk about. If anybody wants to comment on something specific, or happy to do that. But otherwise, we begin. And I have to just warn you, like I said, this is one of my favorite parshas. So you may hear things that I said in the past because it's just too much fun.
What was that?
My driveway project, Akela, I told him what he wanted. He's going to.
Okay, there's a lot to say here. Just thinking where to start. We want to start with the Hanukkah angle because it's today's Hanukkah. Today's the seventh candle. Tonight's the eighth candle. So maybe related to Hanukkah. But there's a lot to say here. Give me just a second. We'll open up the actual text and we'll see what we want to talk about. Okay. The first question is. Is this like such a terrible nightmare? He wakes up in the morning and it says he's totally shaken. So he has one dream and then he has a second dream. And then in the morning, now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called all the necromancers of Egypt and all its sages, and Pharaoh related to them his dream, but no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. And obviously, this is very traumatic for him because the moment someone has an interpretation, he says, okay, I'm appointing you king over Egypt. I'm appointing you second in command over Egypt. So obviously, this is very important to him. What's the big deal? So he had a little dream, and he had two dreams. So big deal. What's the dream? Let's look at number 2. And behold, from the Nile. So it came to pass, we'll look at verse 1. It came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh was dreaming, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And behold, from the Nile were coming up 7 cows of handsome appearance and robust flesh, and they pastured in the marshland. And behold, 7 other cows were coming up after them from the Nile, of ugly appearance and lean of flesh, but they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. And the cows of ugly appearance and lean flesh devoured the 7 cows that were of handsome appearance and healthy. Then Pharaoh awoke, and he falls asleep, and the same concept happens. And behold, 7 ears of grain, thin and beaten by the east wind, were growing up after them. Up after them, and the thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy and full ears of grain. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it's a dream, and he's shaken. And the funny thing is that nobody could interpret this dream, which seems like a very straightforward interpretation. We know what could be more simple than healthy ears of grain is years of plenty and beaten ears of grain is years of famine. Like, what's so difficult? You should be able to know that in the first year of dream interpretation in the academies of Egypt. What's the big deal? So that's the question of why nobody else could interpret it. But the real question is, why is Pharaoh so shaken? So the simple interpretation is that Pharaoh is shaken because one interpretation is like this. Why is Pharaoh so shaken? So Pharaoh is the king. Okay, kings are paranoid. What are they paranoid about? They're paranoid about all the people who are trying to overthrow them. It could be other countries, it could be neighboring countries, it could be civil uprisings, it could be anything. But if you're a king and you have all that power and you have so many people subjugated to you, you have a lot of worries, you have a lot of fears of threats to your power. So what does Pharaoh do to deal with all these conscious and subconscious threats, or he's afraid that all this is going to happen? So what does he do with all this fear? How does he reassure himself? So for Pharaoh, if you put yourself in Pharaoh's shoes, for decades, Pharaoh keeps reminding himself, don't worry, you're powerful. You're the most powerful king on earth. You're in Egypt. You're the king of the most mighty empire on earth. There's nothing to worry about. Okay? So your own power will be able to overcome all the threats. This dream shakes him. Why does this dream shake him? Because the skinny cows eat the fat cows. The powerless overcome the powerful. Okay? So this has touched him at a very raw nerve within himself. And that's why he's shaken. He can't go on. And everybody has to try to help calm him down and give him the interpretation. Nobody succeeds. We'll talk about why no one succeeds. That's another story. But why is he shaken to begin with? I mean, I had plenty of nightmares in my life. This doesn't seem so bad. So the skinny cows eat the fat cows. Who cares? No, but this is the model. This breaks the model. The model is, he keeps telling himself, the powerful will overcome the weak. And that's why I'm so strong. I'm so mighty. My kingdom is so mighty. We'll overcome any threats. But if he realizes that this what this dream is telling him, no, the weak overcome the mighty, all of a sudden that's frightening to him. Now, there's a very interesting comment by the Zohar, which is the mystical teachings of Judaism. And the Zohar says as follows, that Joseph hears Pharaoh's dreams, understands many layers of interpretation, gives Pharaoh one of those layers, but there's more insight in these dreams that he doesn't tell Pharaoh. So we know what Joseph tells Pharaoh: you're going to have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, and then collect during the 7 years of plenty for the 7 years of famine, and live happily ever after. And that's what happens. But really, but there's deeper interpretations to this dream. So some commentaries say, what is the deeper interpretation of this dream? The dream is Joseph understand that the mighty overcome the powerful. It doesn't always work. It's not always about physical might. Often there are other factors, and the weak can overcome the mighty, like sort of David and Goliath story. And why is that so important? Because what's happening in this story, all this story in a way, what's the overarching purpose of the story? Yes, it's the reunification of Joseph with his brothers. That's part of the story. But also, if you want to talk about the trajectory of where the story is going, this story is what brings the Jewish people to Egypt and ultimately to slavery and exile in Egypt. Because next week's Parsha, the family comes down and is transported and transplanted to Egypt from Israel. Because once they discover who Joseph is, Joseph reveals his identity. He invites his father and his family to come live with him in Egypt, and they do. And that's the culmination of the dream, of the promise that God tells Abraham hundreds of years earlier, that you should know that your descendants are going to be slaves in a foreign land, and in 400 years they're going to come back. So this is God's plan taking effect. So in a way, the Jewish people, Joseph is bringing the Jewish people to a place of comfort in Egypt, but it's also the beginning of an exile. And maybe what Joseph understands is, do not fear the exile, because ultimately it's not always that the mighty prevail. Sometimes the weak prevail. And the Jewish people were much weaker than the Egyptians. Of course, they were enslaved, but ultimately they prevailed and they were able to leave. And if you want to talk about the story of Hanukkah, we read this story always around Hanukkah. In some sense, this is the story of the Maccabees, right? They go up against the mightiest army of the time, the Greek army. At the time, the Greek army was undefeated. They had the systems of war, which was impossible to defeat. The way they would line up their soldiers, they had undefeated, and yet the Jewish people are able to stand up against them. And we know what we say in the prayer, that God gave the mighty into the hands of the weak. And this is all related to the story where this is what Pharaoh sees, and this is what shakes Pharaoh. And that's why he's so troubled, because it touches a deep nerve within himself. Because again, like I said, in his mind, might prevails. And this is a story which says, no, might doesn't prevail. And that's why Joseph tells him the interpretation. He's very happy with it. But like I said, there are deeper interpretations. It's not just the interpretation that Joseph authored. There are other interpretations as well that Joseph kept for himself. Okay, now we get to the elephant in the room, and that is all the commentaries ask this very simple question. It's essentially two questions. The second follows the first. What is the big deal? Why can't anybody else come up with this dream, with this interpretation? Remember, this is very extreme. To take somebody, a slave, from prison in Egypt, there's no upward mobility. It's all about class. And if you're a slave, you can't become free. So for somebody to come from being a slave to become the second in command in Egypt is absolutely unheard of. He had to say something so powerful and so radical and so amazing that nobody else can think of to earn him that job. And that's in fact what happens. Pharaoh tells his people, after Joseph offers the interpretation, he says, now that God gave you this insight, there's nobody as wise as you in the entire Egypt, and therefore you're going to be in charge. So the question is, what's the big deal? Seemingly, it's a very simple interpretation. 7 fat cows is 7 fat years, 7 good years, 7 skinny cows, 7 bad years. The bad years follow the good years. Egypt is going to suffer a crisis, a famine crisis, devastation. And therefore, Joseph says, I have a piece of advice for you. Why don't you collect in the years of famine to the years of plenty? This seems straightforward. This doesn't seem very, very enlightening or very complicated or very exciting. So that is the question, which could be broken down to multiple questions, depending on what you want the answer to be. But there's all kinds of nuances here, which are very, very, very interesting. And each one sort of opens up another whole way of thinking. So I'm going to start with 1 or 2 points, and then maybe we'll expand it. The first point we'll start with is, how come nobody else can come up with this interpretation if we know that Egypt has wise people, has people who are magicians, they're experts in the supernatural, they're experts in magic, in dream interpretation. This doesn't seem to be a big deal for them. And in fact, Rashi does say that other people offered interpretations, because the verse says, if you look at the verse carefully, it says, let me show you the verse because this is going to be important. Open Rashi. Okay, so the verse says that when he wakes up in the morning, Pharaoh related to them, meaning to all the scholars, his dreams, but no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. Says Rashi. Rashi explains that the words no one interpreted them for Pharaoh is significant. It means they did interpret it, but they offered interpretations that Pharaoh would not accept. So that's what it says. But no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. Says Rashi, quoting the Medrash, they did interpret them, but not for Pharaoh, for their voice did not reach his ears, and he had no satisfaction from their interpretation. For they said, you will beget 7 daughters, and you will bury 7 daughters. That's the option. That's the interpretations that they offered. And it's going to be important because we'll understand by analyzing what they told Pharaoh, we'll understand why they didn't tell Pharaoh what Joseph said. But what do they say? They say very simple. You have 7 fat cows and 7 daughters, 7 skinny cows and 7 dead daughters. 7 daughters will be born, 7 daughters will die. Elsewhere in the Medrash, it says a very similar concept about 7 cities. You'll conquer 7 cities, and then you'll lose 7 cities. Pharaoh is like, he's not buying that. That wasn't doing it for him. So he wasn't happy with that. So that's when the verse says, no one interpreted for Pharaoh. It means that they interpreted, he just didn't like it. Okay, so let's start from the very beginning and say why nobody else could interpret Pharaoh's dreams. I have 2 answers. I'm going to start with the first one, we'll start with the first one. First answer is because Joseph broke every rule of dream interpretation of Pharaoh, of Egypt, of Egyptian dream interpretation. He shattered the model, he threw out every textbook, and he violated every rule of dream interpretation. How did he do that? The first thing you never ever do in dream interpretation, never do this. Okay? Never say that a symbol in a dream represents a unit of time. Never do that. It's a terrible idea. Okay, so in Egypt, they tell you all the concepts, whatever, every symbol, what it represents. Never say it represents a symbol of time. Impossible. It doesn't, you don't do that. There are many reasons why you wouldn't do it. My best reason is because it's a bad idea, because you will be disproven easily. So, for example, if you go on the television this morning and you're going to have all kinds of experts telling you which stock is going to go up and which stock is going to go down, am I right? Yeah. But if they tell you what time it's going to go up or what day it's going to go up, they're going to be proven wrong. Because if they knew, they wouldn't be on television, they would be trading stocks, right? So the point here is that if you give a time frame, it's very easy for you to be disproven. So if you tell Pharaoh, you're going to have 7 daughters, okay, how is he going to know that you were proven wrong? I don't know, it may take 100 years till he realizes you're wrong. By then, either he'll be dead or you'll be dead. It's not a problem. But if you tell Pharaoh something that, you're going to have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, that's very much testable. And that's why it's a terrible idea. Never do that. So Joseph is extremely bold, and he goes out and he says, a symbol in the dream, fat cows, skinny cows, fat ears of grain, skinny ears of grain, are units of time. Okay, this guy is bold. Not only is he bold, but he says they're 14 years. Not only have 14 years, but he says if the dream happened twice, it's because God is making it happen right now. It's starting right now. The clock is ticking right now. So not only does he say there's going to be a financial crisis in 7 years from now, but he says it's going to be in 7 years from today. Okay, so that's extremely bold, breath of fresh air. Okay, that's point number one. Now, let's go back a little bit. Let's trace back a little bit. Last week's Parsha, if you remember, we had 2 other dreams. We had 2 other dreams, which is Joseph is in prison, and the baker and the butler both have dreams. And Pharaoh and Joseph interprets the dreams for them. And in those dreams, and then he says one will be hung by the Pharaoh and one will be restored. The butler will be restored back to his position. And whatever Joseph said happened. And that's important to the plot because now they knew that Joseph is a expert dream interpreter. So when Joseph needs when Pharaoh needs an interpretation, they call Joseph. But so you could say, why is that part of the story? Because it advances the plot. But all the details in the story, why do you need all those details? So if you want to take a careful look, you will see that in fact, what happens in that dream, those dreams of last week's Parsha help Joseph interpret this week's Parsha, these dreams. So in other words, the dreams of the baker and the butler allow Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams correctly. So in other words, basically, he gets easy dreams, he gets an easy insight, and the easy insight allows him now to apply it to Pharaoh's dreams, and you'll see what I mean. And then as soon as we finish with this point, we'll go to the deeper point and say, what's the deeper issue that's taking place here? So I'm going to share the screen again, and we're going to go to last week's dreams. And what's last week's dream? So he wakes up in the morning, and basically the baker and the butler each say they had a dream. So he starts telling the dreams. What does he say? He says, so the chief cupbearer related to in his dream to Joseph, and he said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine is before me, and on the vine there are 3 tendrils, and it seemed to be blossoming, and its buds came out, its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. What does Joseph say? And now you read it, the verse simply, it doesn't sound like a big deal. But based on what I just said, this is the key concept. This is the key phrase. And this is what Joseph was so radical. What does Joseph say? Joseph says in verse 12, this is the key. And Joseph said to him, this is the meaning. The 3 tendrils are 3 days. Okay. You have 3 tendrils. You have 3 branches of grape. You have 3 twigs of grapes. These are the 3 equals 3 days. And he says in 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position. And that's exactly what happens. And in the next dream, the baker also has 3 baskets. Joseph says it's 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will kill you. What happened in 3 days? 3 days was Pharaoh's birthday party. And Pharaoh's birthday party, he goes and thinks about all his ministers. And then he at the party, he decides what's going to happen to them. So here, Joseph has some insight. 3 days before the party, both of these dreams have something that is 3 days, 3 objects. So he says the object represents a unit of time. And that's where he gets his insight. And therefore, when it comes to Egypt, when it comes to Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh has dreams of 7 cows and 7 fat cows and skinny cows. Once again, Joseph says, easy, 7 cows, 7 years. So I said, it wasn't this easy. Wouldn't anyone think of it? Nobody would think of it. Nobody would want to say that it's a unit of time. So that's the first thing. But now we get to a deeper concept. The deeper concept is you have to put yourself in the shoes of the Egyptian culture and of their philosophy of life and of their theology, really. And in their mind, you have many gods. Of course, it's a pagan culture. Many gods. Gods are not necessarily good, but gods are all powerful. And everything that happens in this world is determined by the gods. In other words, there's no real free choice, right? If you want to, these are cultures that don't have much morality. And the way you get rid of morality is no free choice. If I do something, I'm a product of the gods. The gods push me to do certain things. That sort of absolves the person of free and personal choice. So if you come to Pharaoh, if any Egyptian expert would say the following story: the gods decided that they want to bring famine to Egypt, and therefore, Pharaoh, we think you should store grain in the years of famine and store it for the years of plenty and store it for the years of famine. That would be insane. That would not work for Egyptian culture, because they would say you're just wasting your grain. Because if the gods want to destroy you, they will destroy you. If the gods want famine, they will bring famine. And you storing some grain in the years of plenty is not going to help. And therefore, when Joseph comes up and Joseph says, you don't understand, Pharaoh. The gods are not telling you what they're going to do, that they're going to give years of plenty and then years of famine and they're going to destroy Egypt. That's not what the God is telling you, that we're about to destroy you, because if that's what God is telling you, there's no point of telling you that. If he wants to destroy you, he'll destroy you. What's the point of telling him? What Joseph tells Pharaoh is God is telling you what's the problem that's here, so that you find a solution. In other words, things are not determined. It's God wants you to take initiative and protect yourself and save yourself and save the civilization of Egypt in the process. But again, nobody else could tell that to Pharaoh, and nobody else could really implement this plan, because they come from a culture that is very deterministic, and they don't believe that human action has value and human action could help you survive if the gods want to bring famine. So in that case, what Joseph does, it's not just that he knows how to interpret the dream. It's much deeper than that. It's that Joseph comes to the table with a belief system that says that the human being has a power to protect himself and help better society, not because he can go against the gods, because that is what God wants the person to do. And if God tells you that the difficulty is coming, it's not because God is trying to destroy you, it's because God wants you to take initiative to protect yourself and protect society. And in that sense, this concept is very empowering to Egypt, to Pharaoh. And he says, nobody else could do this. No one else has that built-in optimism that we could actually prepare against the famine that is going to be brought by nature, by God, whatever. Only an outsider who has a deep belief in that God-given ability for free choice, only an outsider would be able to save this country and this economy. And that's exactly what happens, and that's why Pharaoh is so impressed. So to summarize, why is Pharaoh so impressed? And why could nobody else come up with this idea? Number one, because of the units of time issue. It's very bold to say that the dream a symbol in a dream represents a unit of time, because then you put yourself out there and you make it very easy to disprove you. So nobody else is going to do it. And Joseph is very bold, and people come with bold solutions, and not only bold, but they actually put themselves on the line, which is really what Joseph is doing here. They put their reputation on the line in a way that can be tested. So Pharaoh is impressed with that. Number two, the idea that God is bringing a famine, yet God wants us to protect against the famine, and God wants us to prepare for the famine and overcome the famine. That is something that Pharaoh it's impossible for him to accept. I mean, he accepts it, but it's not part of his culture or any of his people. He can't appoint an insider from Egyptian society to do that, because it's counter to their way of thinking and a counter to their belief system. So that is a little bit on the dreams. If any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we kind of go a little bit deeper, one more dimension, and then we could see where else we're going to go. Okay.
The time.
Time? Oh,
Rabbi,
yes.
you raise a very, very interesting point about the specific role of an outsider, and in this instance, a Jew who's an outsider.
Right.
Does this theme come up throughout the Torah in other ways, the role of the outsider in bringing a unique insight?
Yes,
would
yes,
not-
yes. And in fact, you have outsiders who are not Jewish who bring insight. So, for example, right after the giving of the Torah tells us a story of, well, it's written right before the giving of the Torah, but same idea. It's not clear, it's out of order, but that's another discussion, where Moses is the only judge. And people come to Moses for insight, for judgment, and they literally wait online from the morning to the night. And Jethro, Moshe's father-in-law, who is not Jewish, there's a debate whether he converted, but the point is that he doesn't stay with the Jewish people. Initially, he was a Midianite priest, priest for idol worship. Later, he converts, but then he goes back to Midian. The bottom line is, he comes and he tells Moshe that he says, what you're doing is a terrible idea. You have to appoint a hierarchy of judges, and you can't be the only one to judge. You have to outsource, and you have to appoint other judges. And that's an example of the judicial system within Judaism was affected by not by Moshe. You say Moses, what's greater than Moses? The lawgiver, right? Moses, the lawgiver, should be able to have all the insight. No, he takes the advice from wherever it comes from. So it comes from an outsider, a non-Jew, a convert, and yet the convert is telling the lawgiver how to set up the judicial system. And there are other examples in Jewish culture where some of the greatest rabbis are outsiders. Some of the greatest rabbis are converts. Rabbi Akiva, a son of a convert, was a total outsider. He was illiterate till he was 40. And basically the Torah, the oral Torah as we have it today, is from the school of Rabbi Akiva. There are other schools that have different perspectives. But yeah, so there's no question all throughout history you see the power of an outsider, because an outsider gets to look at the society with a fresh perspective, and therefore has insight that other people within the society may be very wise, but they're not going to have that same degree of insight. So thank you for that. Okay, now that we got to this issue with the units of time and all that, I want to introduce a concept, an insight from the Rebbe that the Rebbe explained, and I think this is very profound. This is so profound. Let's go back for a second to the units of time issue. Why could nobody else come up with Joseph's insight, with Joseph's idea? So we said units of time, but they don't want to say that it's referring to units of time. They don't want to say that a symbol in a dream represents a unit of time, because my cynical answer was because then they could easily be disproved. Well, let's put that cynical answer aside. Let's say maybe they're open to it, but specifically in this dream, there is a obstacle to say that we're referring to the unit of time. To say that it's 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, there is a problem to say that specifically about this dream. Why am I saying that? So if you look at verse 2 and 3, this is the dream. And behold, so Pharaoh is standing by the Nile, that's verse 1. And behold, from the Nile were coming up 7 cows of handsome appearance and robust flesh, and they pastured in the marshland. Okay. Verse 3. And behold, 7 other cows were coming up after them from the Nile, of ugly appearance and lean flesh, and they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. Now this is the problem. They stood beside the cows in the Nile bank. This is a problem. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because if you're referring to units of time, then the 7 years of famine follow the 7 years of plenty, but they're not standing side by side. They're not occurring simultaneously. Yet in the dream, it's very clear that there's fat cows that are grazing, and then there's skinny cows emerge, And it's not like they emerge and immediately swallow the fat cows. They emerge and they graze and they stand next to the fat cows. And before any other drama unfolds, you have now 14 cows standing next to each other. Now, considering that, it's very difficult to say that the 7 fat cows are 7 years of plenty, and 7 skinny cows are 7 years of famine that will follow. Why? Because here they're not following, here they're side by side. So now we have a problem. Now, even if anybody was inclined to say this refers to the cows and the grains of wheat refer to units of time, even if they would be open to that idea, specifically in this dream, it would be very difficult to say that because both years are simultaneous, and years are not simultaneous. Years are subsequent to each other. So that is the issue with this dream. What does Joseph understand? And what Joseph says is profound. Now, one of the ways the Rebbe asked the Rebbe's question was, Joseph was asked to interpret the dream. He wasn't asked to give advice. So what does he do? He comes out of prison. You're just a prisoner. You're a nobody. You're a Hebrew. You're a Hebrew slave. You're a prisoner. You come before Pharaoh. Pharaoh gives you a mandate. He says, interpret the dream. So he interprets the dream. He said 7 years you're going to have 7 years of famine, follows 7 years of plenty. Be quiet. Why does Joseph continue and offer advice? He says, you know what Pharaoh should do? You should set out people and you should gather the grain in the 7 years of plenty and store it for the 7 years of famine. Why is he telling? Who asked you to give advice? Nobody asked you for your advice. Why is he giving Pharaoh advice? He doesn't have a mandate to give advice. His mandate is only to interpret the dream. So what the Rebbe said, which is in my opinion absolutely brilliant, Joseph is not saying, I am telling you, I'm giving you advice. Joseph is saying the dream itself is telling you what to do. The dream itself is telling you to store grain in the years of plenty for the years of famine. How so? Now he solved the problem that we just had. When you have 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows standing together, what is the message? The message is don't view these years as the famine following the plenty. Make sure those sets of years are simultaneous. How so? Well, it's very simple. If in the years of famine you're eating the grain of the years of plenty, then in the years of famine you actually have the years of plenty because you're eating their grain. And if in the years of plenty you're actually storing for the year of famine, then in the years of famine you have the years of plenty, you have the years of famine. So in other words, what Joseph is saying, the end of verse 3, when they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank, which would not allow any of the interpreters to say that cows are units of time, because if they're units of time, how are they standing next to each other? Joseph takes that problem head on, explains that they are units of time, and the reason why they're standing next to each other, that's the allusion to the solution. In other words, Joseph is telling Pharaoh, this is what you should do. The dream is telling you what you should do. And going back, that's reinforcing what we said earlier, where in their culture, the gods, whatever the gods decide, that determines. And there's no room for human intervention, and there's no room for human free choice. Joseph is saying God is here the dreams are here to shatter that notion, and God is telling you that in any situation. Now it's 11:59, so I got 60 seconds left. But let's go the big picture. The big picture is in any difficulty, anytime there are years of famine, there's years of famine. There are also years of plenty. In other words, any situation, there's the potential. There's the good and the bad mixed in. What Joseph is telling Pharaoh is that you want to make sure that the years of famine and years of plenty happen together, in the sense that in the years of famine, you understand and you realize and you understand the potential that lies in that difficulty. So when there's a difficulty that comes, it's not that the gods are trying to destroy you. It's not that God is trying to destroy you. It's God who wants you to take the initiative and find the solution from within the problem and discover how within the years of famine you can have the years of plenty. And that's Joseph's idea, and that's the application to us. And that's why nobody else in Egypt can come up with this, because it was counter to the way they understood life and society. A lot more to say upon this, but let's stop and take any questions or comments. And that's it. This is a lot of fun. So thank you for joining.
Rabbi, one question.
Yes.
What I find striking about this is that Joseph focuses not merely on understanding, but on solution.
Solution oriented. Yeah. How could that happen? Because in a deterministic world, it's not about solutions. If the gods want to destroy you, they'll destroy you. You're not stronger than them. We say, of course, God is stronger than you. But if God tells you the problem is here, it's not to destroy you, it's to empower you. So that's the big difference. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a question about also the interpretation and the power of abstract thinking that only the person who represents the monotheism can possess. Has anybody talked what it gives? Because the believing in one God is the highest level of abstraction.
Right.
So that's what probably gives Joseph, who is trained in monotheism, who was taught monotheism.
Great point. That's a great point, because symbols are always tangible. And within the world, an object is always much more tangible. An object is obviously much more tangible than time, right? If you want to think about comparing an object to time is more abstract. So Joseph is not afraid of the abstract. So Pharaoh, pagans, it's all about the gods are tangible, and it's the image of God. Everything is tangible, more concrete, and that's what people can understand and relate to. So they assume that if you're dreaming about an event. And but Joseph is thinking more abstractly about time. Yeah, I agree with that. Now I want to say one more. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
Okay, I want to say one more thing, just to continue on this theme. I know it's 11 o'clock, we'll go a few minutes over. If anyone has to leave, that's okay. But a little treat. And how does Pharaoh know Joseph is right? One of the ways Pharaoh knows that Joseph is right is because the Torah tells us the dream twice. This is absolutely fascinating. The Torah tells us what happened in the dream. Then the Torah tells us what Pharaoh told Joseph. So it gives us both those accounts. And whenever the Torah tells you two accounts of the same event, always, this is the rule, 100% of the time. On the surface, it looks like it's a repetition, but it's never a repetition. If it were a repetition, we don't have to say it, right? So what Joseph told, what Pharaoh saw in his dream, which is recounted in Torah first, is one story. What Pharaoh told Joseph is a totally different story. You'll see in a minute why it's so totally different. And it seems similar, but it's not similar because it's based on Pharaoh's own subjective interpretation, which was in this case terribly, terribly wrong. Now you see the brilliance of Joseph, because when Joseph interprets the dream, he does not interpret the dream that Pharaoh tells him. He interprets the dream that Pharaoh saw. And I'm gonna show you case in point. And now Pharaoh says, there's nobody as wise as you, because you were able to see what was my exaggeration, my false exaggeration, and what was true. Okay, so this is fun. I'm not going to add any new insight. Everything I said is already out there. You have all the pieces of the puzzle, but we're going to rearrange. We're going to reshuffle the cards here to have some fun. Okay, so let's look at what Joseph tells Pharaoh, and that this never happened. That's not what he saw. So let's see what Joseph tells Pharaoh. First of all, Joseph tells Pharaoh, when he introduces the fat cows, the skinny cows, he gives a subjective assessment, which I have no problem with. I'm not going to address that. He's entitled to give a subjective observation. I have no problem with that. Let's look at verse 19. He says, after Pharaoh is retelling the story to Joseph, he says, 19, and behold, 7 other cows were ascending from them, emaciated and a very ugly form and with meager flesh. I have not seen such ugly ones throughout the entire land of Egypt. I've never seen such terrible cows. Is that the case? I don't know. In the first dream, it doesn't say it, but it's possible. But you see that he's giving his subjective interpretation, which, like I said, I have no problem with, because this subjective interpretation doesn't tamper with the core of the dream. But the next subjective interpretation is actually completely false. Let's look at verse 21. I'm going to be 20 and 21, but I want to focus on 21. And the meager and ugly cows devoured the first 7 healthy cows, and they went inside them. But it was not known that they had gone inside of them, for their appearance was as ugly as in the beginning. And I awoke. Okay? Almost the entirety of verse 21 is made up. It's not what it says. It's not what it says. What does Pharaoh say? Pharaoh says the ugly cows ate the fat cows, and when they swallowed the fat cows, they swallowed them and they devoured them, and now the ugly cows remain the same. You have no idea that they ever ate them. It was not known that they had gone inside of them, meaning it's like a starving person eats and then you can see he's fattening up a little bit. They were not fattened at all. They look just as bad. Now, I ask you a question. In hindsight, you happen to know the interpretation. You know that what God is telling Joseph to tell Pharaoh, what God is telling Pharaoh is, you should store in the years of famine for the years of plenty. If that's the case, could this be true? Could it be that if you're going to swallow the fat cows, if you're going to eat the grain of the fat cows and the skinny and during the years of famine, there's no change? You look just as bad? Of course not. Here, the skinny cows are going to be saved, right? So, in fact, what Pharaoh says that there was no impact by the skinny cows eating the fat cows, that cannot be true. And in fact, if you turn back to the first time when the Torah recounts Pharaoh's original dream, it doesn't say those statements, those words that you would not have recognized, that the skinny cows ate the fat cows. That does not appear in the Torah. Now Joseph sees the dream. He understands the units of time. He understands the standing together. He understands that the point here, God is telling you, save yourself. Save yourself by storing from the years of famine from the years of plenty to the years of famine. And then Joseph sees that Pharaoh says there was no change. Joseph says, nonsense. That's his own subjective fear that he's projecting on what he saw. He didn't see it. And it happens all the day, all the time. All the scientists explain that a lot of what we see is what we expect to see. And that impacts what we see, certainly in a dream. So now when Joseph interprets every aspect of the dream, but he does not interpret this aspect of the dream, and in fact, he's actually undermining that aspect of the dream because he's basically saying the years of famine are going to save the years of plenty. The years of plenty are going to save the years of famine. Now it makes sense that in the next verse, Pharaoh tells Joseph, after God, not in the future verses, after God informed you of this, there's no one as wise as you in Egypt. Part of the wisdom is to be able to understand and differentiate between Pharaoh's fears and the reality of what Pharaoh saw. Now, Pharaoh initially was influenced by his fears, so he wasn't able to differentiate. But now Joseph explains to him, now he sees what Joseph is doing, and he says, you're right, I didn't see that. Now that I think about it, there was a change. Now that I think about it, when the skinny cows ate the fat cows, they did fatten up a little bit. That's interesting. But he didn't notice that happened, that he saw that. Right? He watched a movie, but he was influenced by his own fears, so he didn't see the subtlety. And now when Joseph tells him that no, the fat cows are going to affect the skinny cows, then Joseph refuses to be distracted by Pharaoh's words. He uses almost a full verse to say that even after they ate them, you would have no idea that they swallow the fat cows. Joseph is like, sorry, that's your own projecting your own fears. That's not what the dreams says. And that's why Joseph did not interpret those dreams. And it's possible that that's also part of the wisdom that Pharaoh sees within Joseph. And he knows Joseph must be right, because Joseph is actually not only doing what Pharaoh is saying, he's actually deviating from what Pharaoh said, but he's touching the truth. So that is the story in short. A lot more to say as always, but this is fun. So thank you for joining. Happy Hanukkah. And we should see each other in good health. Okay. Be well. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Take care. Thank you.